Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Yay, we're back.
Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, good morning.
Bom dia. All right. We have a couple people having internet issues this morning, so we might have a few people trailing in late today, but that's not a problem. I just emailed everybody about 5 minutes ago with links to your groups. If nobody got that, let me know and we'll definitely send out a link to everybody. But good morning, good afternoon. Welcome. We're excited to hammer out all of our ideas. The structure for today, I know we kind of went over it yesterday, but for more detail, so this morning we're going to really hammer out the three main goals of the workshop. And we're going to use the first, about a first hour and a half to smaller breakout sessions, just to kind of get our brain juices flowing, and smaller groups. It'll just be easier for us to talk on a virtual platform. We won't be talking over each other or having to listen to just one person's conversation. So we've assigned you guys to groups. We tried to pick out some, people who had some good conversations yesterday, but we also wanted to have a wide range of seniority. So junior scholars talking with some senior scholars as well, to kind of stimulate some conversation that way. So we did our best to distribute the groups as we saw fit. But so afterwards, we'll come back together and just present our ideas to the group as a whole before we take a break for lunch. So just to reiterate, the main goals that we are going to be discussing in these small breakout sessions and throughout the morning. The first one is to establish a more holistic theoretical framework of infrastructure, one that's rooted in archaeological perspectives and all of the evidence that was presented yesterday. So what does infrastructure look like, and how do we expand notions past Western or possibly urban contexts? The second goal is how does a new archaeological perspective on infrastructure help answer fundamental anthropological questions, pertaining to community organization, cultural identity, social and economic networks, probably some other topics that were discussed yesterday that I'm forgetting, but anything that you guys want to bring to the table that kind of helps answer some of these fundamental questions. And then the third goal is, what are the broader implications of an archaeological engagement with infrastructure? So it's great to develop this for our own research in our own field, but what does it contribute to larger discussions revolving around contemporary infrastructural studies? And how does it help in recognizing how physical infrastructure is related to contemporary social conditions? So this one might be really fun due to all the contemporary discourse surrounding infrastructure, particularly in the United States right now. So I feel like that one will have plenty to discuss, especially in light of what's going on today. So that's going to be the main agenda for the morning. And then in the afternoon, after lunch, we will, we'll spend 2 hours in different breakout groups. So we'll reassign you, and we want to use this time dedicated to developing, and you can use the time for writing as well. We'll share Google Docs for each group, but to kind of develop these mini breakout chapters that are for some key themes. Carly and I were just discussing a couple of the key themes. These are flexible, and again, we'll probably tease out more after our discussion before lunch this morning. But some avenues that we were kind of thinking of were, infrastructure and history was brought up a lot. So was infrastructure and scale, this idea of top down, bottom up, as well as like local and regional. So scale in that sense, and infrastructure and relationality, and maybe infrastructure as assemblage. So these are just some ideas, and we're hoping that the afternoon breakout groups will be used to kind of develop these ideas for mini chapters. So again, 15 to 3,000 words, very short, but that will just might help with the flow of the final volume and the organization of the edited volume. So the afternoon you guys can use for writing and developing these. And again, there'll be smaller groups, and you guys can collaborate and use that time as you see fit. And then the final, we scheduled in a break after yesterday. We got a few messages in the afternoon. So we'll have a short 15-minute break after the afternoon's mini breakout groups. And then we'll come back for the last hour to have some final concluding remarks, and just leave that for final questions and comments. So any questions about the flow or schedule of the day? Anna, Anna Brown, I did say I sent out individual group links. You got that? Okay, good. Okay, well, Carly, do you have anything to add today?
Do you want to send York a link? York, hello. We would love
Good morning.
We would love
Chad sent me the link for the
perfect.
So I can do that if that's okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're more than welcome to participate in those. When we just have our list that we check off.
Right,
obviously.
I understand. Yeah.
So awesome. Okay, that totally works. You can be in that group then. Cool. That's all I had to say, Grace. So
yeah, no, thanks for catching that. We definitely want you to participate. So all right, well, great. Then on that note, everybody can go to your breakout rooms, and we'll kind of just get hammering on these topics, and we will reconvene at 11:30 Eastern time.
Okay.
All right, see you guys then. Welcome back, everybody.
Hello.
Was productive for the last half hour or so before lunch. We want to kind of come back together and discuss as a group what was discussed in those smaller breakout groups. So I guess we'll give each group kind of time to present their main ideas that they talked about. So and then we can all engage in discussion, but just so every group has time to that we can hear what everybody was talking about. So if group one wants to go ahead and present some of their main ideas, we can start the discussion that way. Doesn't have to be one person, you all can.
yeah, how about anybody in group one can just unmute their microphone and cool.
So you can talk about what you were thinking about infrastructure. How are you guys conceptualizing it? How is it, how is infrastructure and archaeological past being linked to our understanding of infrastructure today and stuff like that. So. No interesting discussions from group one. I think that was Daryl Wilkinson, Anna Brown Ribeiro, Chad Hill, Nathan, Catherine.
Well, we talked about scale quite a lot. It was something, I mean, it wasn't sort of one part of the conversation. It felt like something we could never get away from. We kept returning to the issue of scale. I think there was a feeling, I don't want to sort of speak for everyone, but I think there was a feeling that synchronization and rhythms of organization and connectivity and negotiation and consensus building and bringing things into alignment, all this stuff became more infrastructural or seemed more infrastructural or called for an infrastructural analysis, the bigger the scale became. We talked a lot about, the Chad's presentation on the desert kites, and it felt like it was the scale, just how big they were, how many people had to build them, made it feel really infrastructure. So we kept coming back to that point of scale. I think that seemed really fundamental to our discussion. I don't know if the others would want to add anything on that, but
Yeah, when we talked about scale, we talked a lot about the ideas of organization and coordination. So it was not necessarily the scale of the things, but the fact that they were interconnected and coordinated across space or time, that they required people to either do things in coordination or that they presupposed some sort of coordination or simultaneous action, that they produced group social relations, maybe hierarchical or hierarchical social relations, that they implied some sort of cooperation or collaboration. I pushed people to think about interdependence and dependencies a little bit. I'm not sure that everyone necessarily agreed with all of that. And then we talked about, we had an interesting conversation about the idea of visibility and invisibility of infrastructures, and that Darryl made the interesting point that that might be kind of a political late 20th century phenomenon, and that definitely we seem to agree that that scales differently between different classes or groups. And I don't know if Catherine actually made that point. I don't know if you want to pick up on that, Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, it just speaks to the ways that that concept of scale really were part of that discussion, because the visibility and invisibility of infrastructure scales, I think we talked about over time, depending on the landscape that you're on, depending on maybe the materials you have available to construct infrastructure, and also, the level of engagement that an individual or a group of people has with building and maintaining that infrastructure.
Yeah, and social classes, and the more elite you are, the less you're likely to really have to see infrastructure because it's always already there for you. Anything else? I took a lot of notes.
Couple more points that our group talked about, which that I thought were really interesting. Up front was how infrastructures serve to order landscapes and the maybe resources within them, and without the infrastructure, we might go into the archaeological record and very much see a landscape that was very unordered or in kind of chaos without having the infrastructure to make sense of it. So that in some of the presentations yesterday, we look at, okay, this happens this way in the Amazon, but this happens this way in the Middle East, and how those infrastructures may be very different to order the landscapes. And another point that was brought up towards the end of our conversation is not only the maintenance, but also the planning for infrastructure, and how how often does the planning go into infrastructure? The Desert Kites example came up again, and thinking about that petroglyph that Chad showed us, where you've got basically a map of the desert kite on there, and a question came out was, was that drawn before the kite was built or after? Is that a map of reference to help plan, or is it or is it an afterthought of the representation of the thing that was built?
Yeah, Grace, do you want to move on to group 2? That sounds like great.
Yeah, we actually had a lot of overlap. We had some notes here jotted down. But we talked a lot about order as well, and how infrastructure kind of reflects, order is the material manifestation of order, and a locale for changing institutional order that can take place. We originally were thinking of it in terms of control, but order kind of encompasses resistance and inequalities and other things that might manifest as well. We also were talking about infrastructure as a marker of placemaking. So address infrastructure as a product of mobility as well as a marker of order and hierarchy and power. We talked about a lot about it in conjunction with movement as well, and where infrastructure emerge. What else am I missing, you all?
There was that notion of territoriality that we were talking about a little bit too, and kind of notions of property was something that Monica was bringing up.
Yeah, we discussed a case in Brazil with the example of geoglyphs from Acre. And well, trying to understand how infrastructure could help people to have their lands recognized by the national state, Brazilian national state, because we do not have such kind of linkage between archaeology and the contemporary indigenous people, because they were wiped out of that region, and the sites we only know because of deforestation. So there is huge contrast between what means infrastructure for the contemporary Brazilian society and the infrastructure, archaeological infrastructure. In there, it's such recent expansion of the soybean and cattle ranching border, and so recently it was deforested at the last 20 years, but it's already a huge area, and the sites are being destroyed because they are markers of the indigenous ancient history, and the sites challenge the property because they have papers that are so recent and so fragile. The property chain does not exist. So infrastructure there could mean such a strong way to the indigenous people reclaim of their ancestral lands.
Monica, yeah, add anything?
Yes. Yeah, we also thought about the way infrastructure is a lived category as opposed to an analytic category. So there are landscapes in which people might not recognize or say that they're creating infrastructure, but from an analytic perspective, one can abstract that into understanding the landscape as an interconnected one, especially when powerful authorities come to extract resources as the result of that local incremental infrastructure. And then, to add to what Francisco is saying, the idea that infrastructure can also be a category that then informs people, where they do not think that they have an infrastructure, but we say, see, this is an infrastructure that then legitimizes your ancestral place in a landscape. So infrastructure is something that gets applied very broadly, both as an intentional and as an accretionary and as an analytic outcome.
All right, so group 3, if you want to present your all's main themes, and then we'll open the floor to discussion.
Okay, I can start, and then please, anybody in the group, feel free to jump in. I'll leave some things on your turn. Something that we really tried to grapple with at the beginning, again, was this definition of infrastructure and what makes infrastructure unique as a concept to other ideas in archaeology. And Rodrigo kept bringing up facilitation, the facilitation of movement in various ways, but also this act of maintenance and how, though it might require maintenance, it doesn't necessarily people are maintaining it. And what does that mean for infrastructure in terms of degradation or expansion, or just like the change of it over time? We were looking at it as a very dynamic concept that, given the different spatiotemporal context, which is something that we talked about a lot, how different it can look. And we talked a little bit about the historicity or temporality of infrastructure, as was discussed yesterday. We sort of build off that a little bit more, and thinking about the time associated with infrastructure to sort of sometimes even outlive the institutions that they were in, but because we were grappling with this idea of them reflecting society ideas, but then how sometimes when they change, that gets a little bit more complicated. So I would love for somebody to add to that.
I can rescue you, Carly.
Thank you.
On that same kind of idea of infrastructure being reflective of society, we did bring up, in connection to scale, whose ideas of society. It seems to matter, is this state-controlled infrastructure, top, bottom, that sort of thing, that really matters. And we all kind of felt that we needed to be careful to be kind of clear about what was going on there, because when we get into looking at the connection of social identity and that sort of thing to infrastructure, it feels pertinent to say whose ideas are being expressed through it.
And Rodrigo, if you want to elaborate on this a little bit more, your idea about infrastructure giving way to other infrastructures, if maybe that's a point you want to develop.
Sure. No, that we were thinking, again, we were thinking of what makes infrastructure different than other expressions of material culture. And okay, that one that is not limited to just objects, right? Landscapes as well. But that one of those things might be that ability that infrastructure has to attract more infrastructure, and that we don't know that happens with every kind of other material expression, but it seems like infrastructure invites other development, or it becomes some sort of like a testimony of either institutions working or technology being useful, or just the fact that something is possible, right? So that has, like, infrastructure might have that quality of being able to attract and develop more infrastructure.
Yeah, I'll chime in a little bit. And so one thing we talked a little bit about is the relationship between materiality and sort of the immaterial signatures that infrastructure creates and the legacies. And I'll admit in great embarrassment that I showed up at 10 o'clock Central Time. So my epiphany from this, though, is in fact one thing that does become important as we think about infrastructure, is that it develops, it actually creates very significant boundaries in the world we live in. And I spoke briefly about things like how it affects crop rotation, but in one sense, infrastructure really binds us to time and to and I think someone else noted these kinds of ideas of rhythms where fundamentally it is a very constraining element, but in ways that we just don't predict. And I think that was something I certainly picked up in our conversation, was just the sort of the nature of the unintended consequences that infrastructure develops and invites in a certain sense. Plus, apparently, I can't master time zones and basic chronological math. So,
Yeah, Grace, that's pretty much a summary of, I think, all the stuff that we were really getting at in our group. So for our next little section here, we were thinking about kind of opening the floor to general, like now that you've heard everybody's ideas, either questions for each other. It can even relate to yesterday if there are like things that you thought about over the night, just kind of like dwelling on, or some statements that you kind of wanted to start to make on these topics of the three main points that we just discussed. So it's sort of like, I know with so many people, it can be hectic this way, but we did want to give time with everybody to sort of ruminate some of these thoughts as we're all in this together. So does anybody have anything that they want to start off with, or something to like briefly discuss on this topic, or questions for the group to think about, something maybe that you've been struggling with or thinking about and sort of wanted help with that today?
well, I'll go ahead just to get the conversation going and picking up, because now apparently I'm thinking a great deal about time, temporality, and rhythms. I wanted to ask Chad particularly and York, with the things like the desert kites, do those create their own structure of time and rhythm? In other words, if you've invested all that time and effort, that really means you have to kind of keep going back, doesn't it? I mean, it's built, I presume it's built into the seasonality. I don't know enough about gazelles and deserts and rainfall there and stuff like that. But I presume that there is effectively that kind of legacy of investment. It's a sunk cost issue, right? And this is something we've not spoken of with infrastructure in general. Is it sunk cost? So you made the investment, and then that investment makes you and attaches you to these things. And I just wondered if either of you wanted to reflect on that, and whether that's an issue that we might think of. I certainly think of it in the context of China. I mean, the sunk cost issue, the sunk cost fallacy is massive, and it's this dead weight on, it's a kind of gravitational force.
I think also someone else was talking about the issue of once you've created the infrastructure, that also then creates like the long-term same repeating structure through time. So there's that great picture of phone lines following train lines. Anna, thank you. And so I don't know. I'm really interested in having better data to understand how the kites are in use at the same time, and how that would speak to this question of how people are accumulating more and more of them. And once you're like invested in having this system, maintaining it and using it through time, and being sort of tied to how useful they are for you, especially if, as we talked about yesterday, populations of gazelle are changing because the offtake is so dramatic from them. And that we just don't know, for instance, something I've thought about a lot, whether the individual chains are so wide because the variability of where gazelle are crossing the landscape is so big. And so they're that big because they're able to be catching more and more gazelle as they get bigger and bigger, or they end up that big because they're trying to catch the variation and the movement of them. And so rather than them like being more and more investment in getting more and more, they're more and more investment in being more and more actually effective in the first place. I don't know. I think I don't know that we have good answer to this, but it's a great like thing to be thinking about for them for sure. York,
can I jump in?
Yeah.
Following up on that discussion, I think it's a really good idea to think about places like the kites as places where you're sort of locked into using because you've made it and it becomes a part of your annual cycle. But if you build enough of these things, they also become options because the game might not always be in the same place. So thinking about Inuit and Nuxuit and or Blackfeet Pishkins, where you're dependent also on which canyon the caribou went down in, or where the bison are. And if you have prearranged modified landscapes ready, then you have options. So
right, this is yeah, it is exactly. We don't know, I think, enough about the gazelle migrations to know whether it's just like they're only hitting one part of these, and so they're growing this big so that people can be moving around to get to where they are in an annual changing thing, or if there are just lots of groups coming across every year.
It certainly would then suggest that one thing that at all levels of infrastructure is information monitoring and, if you will, information surveillance is an issue with at least things like what we're talking about. You have to know where, in your case, the animals might be, as well as being able to signal to people when to go or how to go or which of these things you might go to. And information is a critical commodity that's often very covert, but nonetheless, actually, I think probably really important for much of the functioning of infrastructure in general.
Well, and I think that point goes back a little bit to being able to recognize or it being sort of underlain within a community. So understanding how to interact with something because you're in the know, because that infrastructure serves your community in a specific way that maybe it wouldn't serve to an outsider's perspective of a community, which we were getting at like a little bit before with how there are all these different functions and it might look disorganized across, between landscapes, but when you understand what's going on, it can become either invisible or just something that you take for granted because it works that way. And that's like how it's supposed to work. So this idea of like information being a part of that system as like an insider's perspective of your own infrastructure in your community is something that maybe people were touching on.
I see that personally in my own case study. The timing of the dance is impacted by how harsh the winter was. Which is something people didn't understand for a long time. And finally, someone thought to ask someone performing the dance. And if it was a very harsh winter, they would do it earlier because the need for spraying and the need to restore that sort of subsistence practice was that much more. So I think taking an infrastructural perspective on that helps you understand it more.
If I can maybe pose a question to the group, and this is obviously open to everybody, if we are sort of done with the previous discussion. Something I asked my smaller group in group 3 was, now some of you guys have already engaged with infrastructure in the past, but some of you are maybe doing this maybe explicitly for the first time or just starting to think about it. But how did applying an explicit perspective of what you're studying as infrastructure, how did that help you develop some of these ideas or make you think of things that maybe you hadn't thought about in the past, or just something that you thought was helpful specifically from an infrastructural perspective to your papers? And I know when you were presenting, you probably got at some of these things, but I was wondering if anybody can make a statement to how this like explicitly was able to help them think about their research and develop it.
Big guinea pig, Carly. As someone who's not actually participating in this, but has been reading a lot about infrastructure over the last couple months, I work in Bronte, Transylvania, where the idea of kind of increasing continental scale trade networks and kind of the institutionalization of long distance trade is a major factor. And like it to the point where people say like, oh, the trade system, right? And I thought infrastructure has been very helpful for me to take apart a broader kind of institutional thing that is about kind of the flow of resources and deal with the kind of institutions that are kind of the economy separate from the material manifestations or the material things that are helping facilitate things through that. And it allows me to, I thought that separation of the institution and then the material aspect that's facilitating the flow allows me to kind of think about how that material thing is being kind of co-opted by people or kind of modified by people or interacted there to kind of create the types of social changes and transformations that we see. So I find the distinction of separating out infrastructure as this material component really interesting to look at, especially when you start thinking about kind of the mechanisms of change.
If I could just jump in, I mean, something I think is very interesting that's been raised by a couple of people is the long-term endurance of infrastructure. So the example that always springs to mind for me is there are roads in England today which were Roman roads originally, and they're basically continuations of the same infrastructure. So, this idea that, civilizations rise and fall, but infrastructure persists in some interesting ways, which is kind of interesting to think of in tension. But, we've talked a lot about infrastructure as part of certain kinds of orders, political orders, socioeconomic orders, but it also transcends those orders. It survives the collapse of some orders and is brought into completely different orders that emerge, 1,000, 2,000, whatever years later. So that temporal endurance of infrastructure is really interesting. I wonder, is that uniquely true of infrastructure? Is it true of certain infrastructures? I mean, I can see it for definitely roads or maybe some field systems. I wonder, are all forms of infrastructure like that? So, is that a unique phenomena, or is it unique in terms of the scale of the temporal depth? And is it certain kinds of infrastructure that we're sort of highlighting there, or is that specific to certain forms rather than being a general feature?
Yeah, that makes sense to me for sure. I don't know about its uniqueness in terms of material culture. We think about those biography of objects and how what something's meant to be when it's produced can be actually quite different how it's used, by other people, or the longer it endures as an heirloom or something like that. But I think this speaks to, in some ways, what TR was talking a little bit about earlier, and also some of the things I was trying to get at in my presentation, which is there's consequences to creating infrastructure that can be unintended, or can be maybe even intentionally appear as though they're unintended, depending on whether you're in a kind of hierarchical state system, or whether you're kind of looking at the unintended consequences of what small scale societies are doing. And this is something we were kind of talking about a little bit in our group as well. So some of this, I think, just depends on maybe the successes of an infrastructure. So the road system you mentioned, placing it in a Roman context, to maybe go around a certain hill so you don't have to go up and over it, or to kind of follow along a river or something like that. Perhaps the reason it is durable because it is so successful. So then, how do we measure the successes of infrastructure? Is it just their long-term durability, or are there other things at play that make them successful?
Right. And let's not forget the power of nature here, right? So TR is talking about things like gravity, water flows downhill. That's something that humans can manage, but never surmount or, negate. And I think one word that also comes to mind here in reference to what Daryl is saying is the word palimpsest, that sometimes infrastructure is there and it's reused because it has this practical humans versus nature intersect kind of aspect to it. Only later do we abstract the symbolism of, the UK and, as a continuation of the Roman world and so on. I don't think that's in the minds of the engineers that are trying to pave something to get from A to B.
Yeah, one thing that, Daryl, your question makes me think about is the question, I think Anna may have raised this yesterday, is the question of sort of innovation and replication. The infrastructure has these long legacies, but at sometimes we break out of them and we diverge from them in really important and innovative ways. And I'm just musing, how does, do we have a way of thinking about this? And do we have a way of understanding the circumstances when people, when the costs and the benefits sort of reach that tipping point, right? And I think also about the nature of replication. I love that. I keep coming back, Monica, those pictures of the rice buns were just great because you think about these getting replicated and over generationally, yet they're never quite the same. There's copy error, right? And how does that affect innovation overall? So, and I don't not quite sure what I'm saying other than it's getting me thinking about how you do this and how it works.
Right. And if I can follow that up with a story about the idea of the replication error. So when we were working at the smaller site of Talapada, one of the folks who was working with us, we were digging a trench that was going down the side of the mound towards the fields. And one of the workers came up to us and said, please don't move that rock. It's the boundary of my field. And I'm looking around and there's like 100 rocks of exactly the same shape and size. And so I said, please kindly take us over and show us exactly which rock you mean so that we don't get confused, right? For us, it was all the same. And even for the other local people, but to him, that one rock was the marker. So, this is the way that infrastructure is also maintained and surveilled at that local level.
I just put in a word for plasticity and options as a source of variation. When we're innovating, we start with something, and if we have infrastructural options, then that can be a source of new ideas.
Lacey, I just saw your comment in the comment chat function. Would you like to discuss that just a little bit? Because I agreed with the discussion before. I know it was sort of like one discussion ago, but
no, yeah, it just made me think too about this idea of archaeologically, when someone brought up palimpsest and the fact that we see what's successful, we often don't see the less successful or the sort of hidden things that might be purposefully destroyed. And so that I agree that endurance and the kind of multi-generational achievements of infrastructure are a really important part of thinking about it, but it also is kind of interesting to think about why it might be purposefully erased and how that contributes to our understanding of infrastructure as sort of the legacy of infrastructure, I guess.
I think erased and also specifically replaced with something else too. And I think sometimes these like intentionally located switches, I guess for lack of a better word, of infrastructure can also be really important to think about. I know like with earth and monuments, sometimes a monument can be present, used, completely deconstructed, and then another monument is constructed. Or in plazas were specifically constructed at sometimes on previous activity areas. Or you see it with the replacement. I mean, not that this is infrastructure, but this idea of like, wow, this is the spot, this is important to the community. And this goes back to, I think, the idea of infrastructure as placemaking and like the importance of infrastructure to what a place is supposed to be doing or how people identify with it, which I think a lot of people got kind of at a little bit in their papers. Monica, what was that? I would love for this comment to be relayed to the group.
Right. So, you know, when you're thinking about things like replacement, and we also talked in our group session about power, the expression of power through infrastructure, you know, one thing that I think would be absolutely germane to this volume is to discuss the role of infrastructure in the promotion or negation of social justice issues, not only in small scale societies, as Francisco has talked about consistently, and others of you have talked about with the Amazon, and as Merritt has talked about, you know, with Ute peoples, but also when we think about these urban infrastructures and how urban infrastructure is a mode of power expression, either through clearance, like Haussmann's famous, you know, clearing of the Paris boulevards, but also when we think about the development of new infrastructure, which is absolutely like today's front page news, right? Like, where are we going to put the new infrastructure, and what communities will this intentionally enhance or damage, and what communities will this accidentally enhance or damage?
Just a case that this reminds me a lot of is the issue in New Mexico of roadside crosses, the descansos, which are memorials placed where people have died in vehicle accidents. So the memorials are placed at the side of the road where the death occurred. So they only exist where they exist because of the highway infrastructure. But this generates a very complicated issue when they need to expand or modify highways, because suddenly they are aligned with all these memorials. And so it generated a bureaucracy that recorded the locations of the memorials and curated them as the road was being widened so that they could be re-emplaced as close as possible to the original point of death and that they were marking once the road was widened. And so there was this whole, I mean, initially the highway authority thought they would just remove them, but politically that was not possible. So they generated this kind of bureaucratic and infrastructural response to the I guess kind of cemeteries that had sprung up because of the existence of the highway itself, right? So this is all about unintended consequences and then the kind of political effects on various communities that are impacted by the need to maintain or restructure infrastructure, which is of course a constant sort of issue that's always arising, right? It's always needing this maintenance, but that maintenance then also impacts other communities that have themselves been impacted by the infrastructure in this kind of recursive way.
Yeah, and certainly I think this is one of the things that I always find challenging about any of these sort of prospects is it's the cyclical tail tasting sort of what comes first type of thing. So Lacey, you mentioned the Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, which is an infamous or famous, depending on your perspective, urban renewal effort. But, you know, Pruitt-Igoe and many of the American housing things came out of an ideology of urban renewal, which really started as an ideological moment as much as it did an infrastructural moment, you know, and they get emplaced in the case of like an American housing situation like that. And then they get torn down, but they've created their own history sort of and you know, the American housing, developments, whether it's Yerba Buena in San Francisco or Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, is it's a very brief moment. But boy, it had a remarkable sort of historical, and again, I come back to this kind of almost social gravity notion. People attach to places very, very quickly. And as a consequence, the shifting of these things becomes very momentous. And Daryl, the New Mexico, event, because these become placemaking, they're real for humans. And that's something that we want to think about. And I'd certainly point out that these, I don't think that these are at all new. I think that they change, and keep in mind that they may also be, to think about them, elements where there was power, but there's also elements where there may have been consensus. And these transformations then attach to interesting social changes, like ritual changes. Mecca, I don't know much about Mecca as a community, but Mecca existed as a community before it became Mecca, right? And in that sense, there is some kind of transformation that took place there.
So in this sense, when we're thinking about these kinds of deep historical ramifications, I keep coming back to this issue, and this is kind of a conceptual project that Carly and Grace and I have been working on as well, is infrastructure before modernity, before the market economy, as Daryl was mentioning yesterday, or before urbanism, inherently different in its approach than modern infrastructure? I mean, there can be different institutions guiding it, different institutions that demand infrastructure to be built or what have you, but is the actual goals, are those different? Or is it uniquely human? Is it just something that humans have been doing for a long time?
Well, and Ed, I think this comes back a lot to the idea of labor. Why labor? I think this is like something that we sort of talked about, but the nature of labor. Are you building it for someone? Are you building it for who and why is it being built? I think infrastructure is a really important consideration. Is it being built for the state? Is it being built for your community? Is it being built to be something that is going to be exclusive? Is it going to take 1,000 people? Is it going to take 100 people? How long is it going to take? I think that is where some of these differences come into with this before urbanism perspective. Is you don't just have a state to organize the construction of an earthen monument. Well, I mean, later you do, but before state level societies that were constructing earth monuments, I mean, Middle Archaic, Watson Brake, why were those people constructing that monument? It's definitely not for their leader, because there was none. So I think that becomes an interesting, well, yeah, I guess in the same sense as a state level society.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of what I meant. But so I think these differences, I think labor, if we're going to label a difference, labor plays a part in that. Although I know the jury, when we had that discussion, Grace, Ed, and I, we didn't really come to a conclusion of whether or not it was different. It was sort of just a thought bubble. So yeah, I'd love to hear feedback on that one, because I think we definitely had some twiddling when thinking about that, because it's kind of a complicated question. Because you don't want to talk about, again, it's not less progressive, different being the key word.
Yeah, for me, when I was first getting into thinking about infrastructure, I was reading all of this stuff, and I kept coming back to this thing where it's like, well, people are investing in moving things, in moving people, in creating durable ties to place for a very long time with similar goals in mind. And I just kept coming back to the notion that it's just that the social institutions that guide it are inherently different. So instead of kinship, world renewal, maintaining cycles of existence being a reason maybe to engage in large scale feasting and mountain construction, for instance, at Watson Break. You have in other cases, more modern institutions driving road networks, power grids, things like that.
But also, sorry, I can add, it also, I mean, I agree with all that. And the challenge of not imposing these meanings and structures into things that are different than us, right? And a very good example for all these conversations about like infrastructure stays over time, survives institutions and political systems. And so it has that other unintended consequence of telling story, of being a witness of history. That's one of the some of the things for other purposes that these groups of specialists are looking in terms of like heritage, right? Patrimony, and this concept of like, when does something become heritage? And the question that they're trying to solve is like, does it need to be preserved or not, right? And what are the reasons for those things? And that's a very, like, in the structure of Daryl, a very late 20th and 21st century problem and issue. This is what we're discussing, right? And what do we want to preserve? And it has to do with all these things that we were talking about, like this political message, this social continuation or cultural continuation. But for example, is this a problem or an issue that people contemplated when they were transforming their farming or movement or whatever other type of infrastructure in the past? Are those things also that they were considering as important? And we might think that it is things like, sorry to talk in terms of Mesoamerica, but these big construction projects for the rulers or the kings in the Maya world, there is a statement, right? And when that statement states or remains or not, things like that. So it's a good way to start thinking about what consequences or not temporality, the permanence of infrastructure might have for today, but is it also useful for before and non-Western views of it? It's just a question. I don't think I adding anything.
Yeah, I think at this sense that, well, it's really a role of, I think that our book will be a reference about the infrastructure definition or definitions in archaeology, but in this sense, about what Rodrigo was telling us, if we can do also the opposite or try to do as possible where it will be possible, I'm saying when we can use the more close to the common sense meaning of infrastructure, or more widely, we can bring this role of the archaeology for this kind of conflicts, because archaeology is central. Every project of contemporary infrastructural building dams or transmission lines and everything deal with this kind of question: what we will preserve and what we will sacrifice. And in Brazil, 99% are sacrificing. So nothing deserves preservation. So maybe with this kind of thinking, more close of Not for sure. Our book will be for the general public, but if we can deal with a with a simpler concept of infrastructure, we can go beyond, I think, at the society as well. This thing.
Well, for me, I think one thing when I think about infrastructure, I keep coming back to thinginess. It's a tangible product, but I'm also reminded, and this is a bad paraphrase, I think it was Winston Churchill said, we built the House of Commons and the House of Commons built us. And again, it's that recursive relationship between materiality, history, and identity, because all of these things get tied together. And my sense is, and maybe this is just an absurdly sort of generalized view, is that this really is a human element. I don't think that this is, I think this is something that does transcend human cultures in different ways, and its manifestation is very different. And in our group, we certainly spoke about an insight I've gained is simply that these elements, whatever we call them, manifest very differently in very different historical cultural contexts, but they do manifest in these, and that recursiveness seems to be coming up repeatedly regardless of the context.
If I could jump in there, something we talked about in our group was the sort of popularity, particularly in the Western United States, of people who want to live off the grid. Which is a political project, but it's expressed as an infrastructural condition to be divested of, the grid, the infrastructural networks, and that's a rejection of the social relationships, the political relationships, the obligations, all the stuff that goes with infrastructure. And in terms of like the decontinuity, I don't think that living off the grid is a 20th or 21st century idea. I certainly in the Andes, I think that there were highlanders who moved into the lowlands to avoid the Incas grid. The road system, the taxation, the whole world that goes with that. I'm sure in ancient China, people moved north, south, east, or maybe not east, north, south, and west to get away from the Han grid. The idea of getting off the grid, I feel like, is a sort of infrastructural version of Scott's sort of anarchist art of not being governed, right? You move away from the grid to get away from a whole network of relationships, the state, and I think that's got a deep history. I think getting off the grid is something we could trace back for as long as there have been grids of any kind, and that's a deep, just I don't know what the word is, universal sort of thing that as much as people invest in these systems, there are always people who want to withdraw from them, move away from them, reject them.
And in doing so, create their own grids.
Okay, Grace. 1 second. Okay, Grace, do you think that is this about the time that we were supposed to end this session? Grace?
Yeah, we can wrap things up before lunch. Monica, did you want to speak to that point you just shared in the chat before we move on? Because it's kind of some interesting points about making archaeology of infrastructure relevant.
Yeah, so I was just typing this up in response to what Ed Henry was just saying. And I really like, there's many things about Zoom that are terrible, and our current lifestyle, but I think the chat function is cool, because we're all thinking about, many different things going at once, and it's an opportunity to sort of put some things into words. So just thinking about what he was challenging us to address, and that is how to make the archaeology of infrastructure relevant. So I was suggesting that it's a recognition of that inheritance, the thinginess, the palimpsest of the past that we are living with today, the recognition that nature is still there and provides the parameters in which people can do things. And then thirdly, the idea that infrastructure is a way of addressing issues that are very important in contemporary life, like issues of visibility, of legitimacy, power, and social justice.
Yeah, that's a great point. So this is one of the also underpinnings in my interest in trying to flesh out infrastructure for my own work is that, I'm working with an archaeological record that has its descendants many, hundreds of miles away in Oklahoma, mostly. And in some ways, trying to say that infrastructure is not necessarily a modern project, I think adds to the complexity and the historicity and the force of history that these people served, that they're completely displaced and erased from. So yeah, that completely, kind of falls in line with many of the things you're saying there, Monica.
Yeah, I think that these are really good points that Monica makes, and I want to follow up on. I've been thinking about what Francisco said about trying to come up, like we want to be able to address all of the things that we're talking about as infrastructure, but also maybe trying to come up with a fundamentally simple definition that can also be applied to these social justice aims, if we are all interested in the potentialities of infrastructure as a way of addressing these kinds of ideas. I think it's really important for indigenous communities in the Amazon and also traditional communities in the Amazon that require these large territories to be able to maintain their ways of life, but especially for indigenous communities that are in the process of undergoing a genocide right now. And I think that infrastructure is a really good way of generating ways of tying people to land and legitimizing claims to land.
I think about on that point, it's also to delegitimize as well. I mean, I'm thinking of the Villa Cristina neighborhood that was built by Mokudani just to attract, to kind of make these populations urban and, live in a gridded neighborhood and have access to paved roads. But it was largely unsuccessful because that wasn't, what people wanted or how they viewed their place or anything. So it's, an example of it, So then on that note, before we break for lunch, why don't we hammer out the themes that we want to discuss in the mini breakout chapters? Colin, you shared a interesting idea on I can't find Colin. There you are. On the chat, which is, infrastructure and social justice, which Monica, you mentioned as well, which is I think would be a great to have a mini chapter on that with Monica Smith, maybe Francisco, Merid, possibly. What are your all's thoughts on something like that? I also think it would be helpful to have a chapter on infrastructure and history, or implications of infrastructure from the past or something along those lines as well. But what are your all's initial thoughts on chapters and ideas?
Also to give some context from the kind of the editor, or sort of the series editor side, kind of what we envision the role of these mini chapters. I think Grace and Carly spoke specifically about the kind of helping the flow of the volume. Also, as a way to potentially keep kind of be a dump for some of the things that we may all want to talk about, or you may all want to talk about, and rather than everyone repeating the same types of things, it could be a way to kind of encourage more kind of cross-pollination of cross-citation within the volume. So that's kind of how we see the benefit of these things. It's kind of the location to maybe create some of this transformative knowledge, the connections that are coming out in these wonderful conversations. But it's also some place where you can have a little bit more, if there are things you see are kind of common themes that maybe, we don't want to have everyone repeating over and over again in the volume. We can kind of centralize that information a little bit.
In Lacey's and my book, the mini chapters also serve to sort of set the stage for subsequent discussions in that section of the book as well.
Yeah, just for reference, we had one that was about houses as assemblages, one that was about super household networks, so how households are interrelated with one another, and then the last one is about measuring change in households, so just as an example.
So is this something that's like divided in parts, like the first half of the book has like the short papers and the second half has like case studies, or how does that get organized?
No, so the short chapters are sort of like Anna just said, they're sort of they can be something that set the stage for a set of chapters. So Monica, were you going to say something towards that? Or no, I'm sorry. I thought you looked like you were going to say, okay. But also, so like, even if it's not something as explicit as ties to social justice, but maybe how archaeology informs modern day, you know what I mean? Like, so we're not looking for like hard, like if you guys have ideas on how you can see these playing out. I see TR, you just threw a comment out there. Do you want to discuss that, or I can look over it real quick?
Well, just responding to what I'm thinking I'm understanding is, particularly in the sort of shared conceptual space, if you want, there ought to be something that sets the stage. What is the definition of the thing we're talking about? Even if it's only because I can then say, I basically disagree with it, but at least I know what I'm responding to. I mean, that's going to be, otherwise they're going to be, I don't know, I can't count because my math is so bad this morning, but a whole lot of people each trying to define what this thing is.
Yeah, I think Grace and I planned on getting at that a little bit in the introduction as well, because we have to have an introduction and conclusion. So some of these bigger ideas, Grace, do you want to speak to any of that, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's important. And Rodrigo just shared some ideas.
These were similar to some of the, actually Rodrigo's ideas are similar to some of our ideas I'm seeing, Grace. They're sort of on the same track that we kind of had, so.
But I agree with Carly, in the intro, and Megan Howie's going to be writing that with us as well. But we'll hammer out the, a more clear definition that people could use. And then the subsequent chapters are going to be more organizational, and as well as like to help structure the or to have everybody kind of draw from these themes and have discussions that we talked about here. But Rodrigo's are nice. The temporalities of infrastructure, infrastructure is dynamic. Maybe infrastructure is relational, or even as assemblage too. I know Anna Brown Rivero was talking about that a lot. I feel like Daryl Wilkinson, you were kind of touching on that as well.
Ed mentioned it yesterday.
Sorry,
I said Ed was talking about it yesterday too.
And historicity and permanence. And in scale, Rodrigo, are you talking in terms of like top down, bottom up scale, or
any yeah. Size or structure or the way they're built and created and used?
Yeah, I mean, in our group, we talked about so many different aspects of the scale of infrastructure, scales of visibility of control modification at, you know, landscape versus urban scales. And so I think important and broad.
Okay, and so Grace and I don't want to force any of you guys to be writing on a topic that you don't want. So do some, like Catherine just said, there's, you know, some people already thinking about scales we mentioned a lot. Is anybody gravitating towards some of these? Because we want to be able to organize you in groups where you can sort of talk about these a little bit and have that time and space to sort of develop some of these little mini chapter ideas that are, again, they're super short. So
Can we email you over this little break?
yeah, absolutely. I think, Monica, I think that's a great idea. I think everybody should sort of think, especially Rodrigo's 4 are like almost the exact, we only had 3, but Grace, these are like almost the exact same 3 that we had. But definitely if you have like a different idea, but take like a screenshot or a picture of those or something, or copy and paste them, think on them, you could send an email to Grace and I, or Grace or I, and then we'll also talk about some stuff over lunch. So then originally we were going to have you guys go directly into breakout groups, but why don't we convene on this link? And then we can break you guys again into groups. Does that work for everybody? Okay. I see good thumbs up and head shakes. So, okay.
Oh, what time are we meeting, or how?
We're going to do an hour for lunch. So I guess if we wanted to come back at around like, well, what time? 2 hours. So like, TR, I can't do math either. 1:45 maybe? Is that the 1:45 Eastern? Is that an hour from you guys? I'm trying to do like add 2 hours, add an hour. Okay, so 1:45 Eastern time, back from lunch. And then everybody else can do your own math for that. So
sounds good. So yeah, see everybody in an hour.
Yeah, thank you.
You want to go ahead and explain the afternoon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for the afternoon, wait, Grace, did you upload the group somewhere, or should I just read them off for now?
You can go ahead and read them off. I posted them on the schedule, and I also uploaded the shared sheets to the SharePoint on our OnePoint drive.
Okay, so for the second half of the day, we're going to have 4 groups. The first one is going to be focusing on the temporalities of infrastructure / historicity and kind of this idea of permanence and such. That's going to be Ed and Rodrigo. And then for infrastructure as dynamic and relational, we have Dr. Anna Brown Ribeiro and Married. And then for scale of infrastructure, we have TR and Catherine. And so Chad was unable to be here this afternoon. If we deem that it's like appropriate to include him on in these mini chapters, though he's not here, he will also be in that group, but we'll see what happens kind of today and make that call. And then the relevance of infrastructure. So looking at how infrastructure is relevant to today through archaeology is Monica, Francisco, and that was who we had in that group. So for these groups, and York. Okay, so then actually York, hello. We're gonna place you actually in with this scales group. So with TR and Catherine for scales, if you are okay with that. Okay, and then so because these mini, Daryl, did we not say your name?
So I don't think I'm assigned to a group.
Oh, you are, but Grace, where did you? We sent a couple versions back and forth, so you just might not be on a version that I had. So
did you reply with a preference?
No.
Oh, okay. Do you have a preference for where you want to?
Not strongly, whatever you think.
I think fit well in, infrastructure is relational, possibly dynamic.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so that's with Anna, Brunabaro, and Marin.
Perfect. Okay, cool. And then so because these chapters are, oh, yes, okay. Cool. Because these chapters are meant for you guys to sort of hash out these ideas in terms of what we've been talking about, Grace and I are going to be sitting in on a different group every 30 minutes, but like, we don't want to be intruding on like your guys' thought process about these, because this is like your time to shine with these ideas that we've been talking about in regards to these topics. So we're happy to help and contribute, but we do not plan on being authors on these chapters. That is for you guys, not for us. So also the Winslow people are going to be in this main room, just sort of chilling out or maybe popping in once in a while. But if you guys feel like you need somebody to sort of facilitate a conversation or to hash out an idea that you're like struggling on or something like that, any possible use that you could maybe just use another body for another person to like contribute ideas or whatever it may be, feel free to come back to this link and then pull somebody or into this room. Because Colin, are we just going to do breakout rooms within Zoom? Okay, cool. So yeah, feel free to come back to the main room and just like say, pull somebody in. But that's how we're going to start with this and see how it goes. If we need to assign Colin and all of them to rooms, then we will do that.
I'll open all the rooms.
No, sorry, Catherine is in, yeah, not relevance. She's in scale. Grace, yeah, that was a previous version.
Can you just run by again, just help me understand what we're looking for in this? I'm a little fuzzy.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. We sort of keep hinting at it and maybe don't flesh it out fully. So these chapters, which are only meant to be capped at 1,500 to about 2,500 words, are just meant to be organizing features within the full volume. So your paper is relevant to a specific topic, as are two other people's. We would put this little chapter at the beginning to introduce your guys' sort of main-ish topics. So this is a way, because this book is meant to be a guide for people who are trying to understand archaeology and infrastructure together. So these little breakout chapters, yeah, mini prefaces, that's a good way to put it. This is meant to like kind of organize thoughts about infrastructure and what's important to archaeology. So these mini breakout chapters kind of do that just more so explicitly. And also, like Colin had said before, if there are ideas that that little group of people or even other people in the volume are going to want to be pulling from very often, there's like cross citation, but also you don't have to keep repeating yourself. Not everybody has to hash out how important scale is to infrastructure or the temporality of infrastructure. You're able to sort of use these as references, if that makes sense.
So not everybody has the same 1.5-page theory section.
Yeah, exactly. Like nobody says like infrastructure is defined as, and then like this is what is important. Exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of us did start our presentations with kind of stuff like that because we were all tackling it from different perspectives. But also, you don't necessarily have to agree with everything that is said, but then that's another way that you're able to engage with that material as well. So does anybody else have any questions about that? We are going to give out, Grace, you have the Google Docs. Do you have a link?
Yeah, they're all, I'll resend the link in the chat now, actually.
Cool. So every group has their own Google Docs that you guys can write, hash out ideas, pretty much get as much development on these little chapters as possible. So that just in these 2 hours, you can have something that is looking almost like a draft or an outline or something like that. So that is what these next 2 hours are going to be. And then we have a break built in after that to just kind of, I think it's only 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and sort of talk together about what we went over today, some stuff moving forward in the workshop, and also just any concluding remarks from anybody as well as us. So how does that sound for everybody? Cool. Okay. So Alan, how do we do this breakout thing? Oh, I see the button that says breakout rooms.
So I've opened up the 4 breakout rooms, and people can, if they've got the updated version of Zoom, they can join the room associated with your group.
Where do you see the room? Well, to close the day, then we just want to kind of hear from each of the groups and just kind of see where you're at and where you're heading. And then we'll wrap it up with some final remarks. But we can start with let's hear from Ed and Rodrigo.
Right. So we had the history and temporality mini chapter, and we basically were able to kind of flesh out a proposed outline for this that I think will draw on a lot of the topics that people have raised throughout the workshop. But if there's something that I kind of mentioned here, or that you don't agree with, or something that maybe I'm missing, please definitely let us know, and we'd be happy to kind of wrestle with that as well. So basically, we thought about starting out as this kind of looking at infrastructure in this way that other people have talked about it as these kinds of qualities or essences. And one of those that are extremely important and something that I think is inherent to infrastructure is its temporality and its historicity. So we talk about basically trying to break down those two differences and for their historicity, kind of talk about its durability, but also its fragility, and even talk about infrastructure from heritage perspectives as well, when it does endure that long. And so in some ways, we're wrestling with kind of in that heritage section, the permanence in some ways of infrastructure in terms of how contemporary groups will latch onto it for new and sometimes reasons that would continually kind of oppress people that could have links to it, but also kind of looking at it as still continuing to alter everyday life and in terms of how people are kind of interacting with it. We then talk about kind of some distinct temporalities as both the history of infrastructure, but kind of separate from historical processes. And so talking about it in terms of built on that installed base of some sort or having these historical foundations, we talk about that as the precedent or the origins of motivations for why people would want to move in that direction of, constructing, maintaining infrastructure. And then we do talk about the construction itself as a part of the kind of temporal trajectory for infrastructure. And then we talk about use, but wrestle with the fact that we may not be able to historically trace all of the differences in uses through time, because if infrastructure itself is not changing in its form, or the material residues of people using infrastructure in different ways is not discernible, we actually may be missing some of the complexities in how people are engaging with infrastructure after the fact. So becomes this question of archaeologically, we think we can see like kind of larger moments of change when infrastructure appears. Maybe we can see a little bit of the precedent or can trace that out. But big things that we can trace archaeologically in some ways is its appearance, and then how people decide to do something different with it in a kind of more drastic and material way. So that includes this repurposing or abandonment. And then we basically just conclude that this aspect of time and history is something that really can't be divorced from infrastructure. And so, that adds to its dynamic aspects. It's both a product of history and also can drive historical change through successes or failures, right? So that's kind of an outline of our little mini chapter. So if anybody has things to say, Rodrigo, you too, if that there was something else you wanted to add, of course.
No, really. That's what we were discussing, how we were trying to present this, and but yeah, nothing else.
Cool.
Excellent. That sounds great. Thank you for sharing that with us, Ed. if the next group wants to present their ideas, Anna, Daryl, and Maren.
Yeah, well, so we basically talked a little bit as sort of an opening set of statements about how what we're really interested in is infrastructural relations, and infrastructure aren't a thing per se. It's a sort of set of relations. So what we call infrastructure, infrastructures are kind of like a snapshot of a particular set of infrastructural relations that are inherent in a particular moment or time or place. And then within that theme of relations, we kind of broke it down into 3 subcomponents. So we thought about relations of dependency. We spent a long time talking about how people get sort of invested in certain kinds of infrastructural networks that are very costly to withdraw from, at least in terms of the kind of political or institutional world that you built around them. So you often have to create more and more layers of dependency in order to maintain that. And this also sort of tied into a discussion about fragility, right? So the more layers you put in to maintain your system, the more complex it becomes, the more likely it is to undergo some kind of breakdown. So you get these kind of paths of dependency that form. Although we also felt that that was maybe true of some infrastructural paths more than others, right? Sometimes people try to rather than shore up the existing system, adapt it and create a more system with more redundancies rather than try and build a house of cards kind of thing. So we talked a lot about dependency and its different kinds of permutations. Another aspect of relations we talked about were things like coordination, particularly say temporal or spatial aspects of coordination. So sometimes different events in different parts of different infrastructural components have to be synchronized. In other contexts, they have to occur sequentially in a certain kind of order at a certain length of time. So there's all kinds of aspects of coordinated relationships that are important within that. And then the third kind of relationship or form of relation that we talked about was antagonistic versus more harmonious relations. So and one way we can think about that is that infrastructures can attempt to work with certain kinds of environmental or natural rhythms or try and work against them. And we talked a lot about floods in this case, right? So do you try to do what most Western infrastructure does, which is create a world where floods just don't happen so that when floods do happen, it's catastrophic? Or do you adapt your infrastructure to assume there's going to be a flood and work with, inundations rather than try and sort of work against that? So that kind of antagonistic versus harmonious interaction between infrastructure and natural forms of rhythm and order. So does your infrastructural order align itself with a natural rhythm like flooding, or does it attempt to sort of run across it in a kind of antagonistic way? And then at the other side of that, and this was sort of heavily inspired, I have to say, by Monica's Venn diagram. And then at the other side of that, we talked a lot about whether or not infrastructures are aligned with or are antagonistic with respect to human rhythms and institutions as well, right? So labor rhythms or movements of people, and so human institutions can all can be antagonistic towards infrastructure, as well as infrastructure being antagonistic towards natural rhythms and flows. So we sort of thought about antagonism and alignment and harmony in sort of both directions. So dependency and coordination and antagonism versus alignment were our sort of 3 qualities of relations that we sort of broke it down into, right? So that was our sort of organizing thing. And then as a final confession, we sort of just dropped the word dynamic because we felt like relational subsumes dynamic. So if you're talking about relationality, you're by definition talking about dynamism. So we just sort of made it about relationality and not dynamism. So yeah, that was our sort of conversation.
Excellent. Anna or Mary, did you all want to add anything, or?
Just that we're glad that you all nodded about dropping dynamicism because we were concerned. So
No, we had originally, infrastructure and relationality. So I'm glad we're on the same page as well. Well, excellent. That sounds like all exciting stuff. So let's move to scale of infrastructure with TR, Catherine, and York.
Catherine, do you want to go or?
Sure. So we started out by kind of identifying ways that we felt that scale was relevant or important in talking about agriculture or about infrastructure. And there are many examples, and we kind of narrowed it down to 5 sort of broader categories of broader scalar categories. So we talked about size of infrastructural projects as one, the ways in which environment can impact the scale of infrastructure and how that represents feedback. We talked about the scale of participation and the scale of relationality and temporal scale. And within each of those broader categories, we sort of identified some subcategories. So for instance, project size, we talked about how this is relevant in many aspects, including in labor and planning, organization, mobilization, as well as maintenance and upkeep of systems. And the sort of multiple scales of local versus landscape, urban versus non-urban, within the sort of context of environment. We talked about how you can see these different scales in gradients of environmental variables and shifts, and the way that that introduces kind of feedbacks between people trying to build infrastructure in certain environments, the impact of the environment on those choices, and how over time those will feedback with different results. We also touched on scales of organization and control, the sort of discussion that we've had of top-down versus bottom-up. And then finally, with scales of relationality, this is kind of a broader category, but we talked about how infrastructure tends to be it expresses relationships between people and things and the environment, and how as well we also touched on that idea of the larger a system becomes, the more potentially prone it is to failure. And then finally, with the temporal scale, we talked about the potential longevity of certain projects, and how that might be connected to the scale of a project in certain cases, but not always. York or TR, if you want to add anything.
Great, excellent. All right, we'll hear from the last group, relevance of infrastructure, from Monica and Francisco.
Monica?
Francisco.
Okay. We are trying to bring some concrete examples from Amazon and Asia, and trying to contextualize and verticalize the question in relation of the power. If I'm right, Monica, we are going to do some kind of emphasis of the power of the national states over the archaeological infrastructure. So I think we can do interesting cross references with the works of everybody. And the idea is not only in that case, for instance, that I mentioned before for you from the geoglyphs from Acre, for instance, the idea is not only bring the idea of changes in infrastructure, like deep changes in culture or in a more general sense, but trying in Acre we have excellent archaeological records to a comparative question issue between changes in prehistoric, pre-colonial times, and changes in contemporary times in the same place, and in some way involving the same landscape and the same structures, but with different, not only different objectives, but such different ways of human environment relationships. So I think that this could be the result of our work. Monica?
So one thing that is also, I think, important to remember that when we think about the relevance of understanding infrastructure is that it's not just about a particular kind of epistemology. So sometimes yesterday there was some, contesting of, Western epistemologies and understandings against, non-Western. But what we really see archaeologically is that whenever you have power differentials, in ancient cases that are neither Western nor non-Western, the term doesn't even apply. When you have ancient complex societies, they use infrastructure as an element of exercising power and authority, including co-opting the infrastructure that has been created from the bottom up. And so what we wanted to do in this transition is to point out that what we can learn from infrastructure is sometimes the practical thing about where to put a road efficiently, but also the recognition that power, whenever and wherever it appears, is something that then has an impact on the use of infrastructure to extract resources.
Yeah, so interesting. I think that maybe the challenge for me to think more generally from Amazon is think in this sense, because generally infrastructure is thinking from that is belong or originally appears in hierarchical societies. And in Amazon, we have several examples of infrastructure like Shellmount that, if we are right, are the physical result of heterarchical societies, not hierarchical. It's another kind of power, like Michael Hickenberger, a long time teaching for us about another kind of power that is present in social relationships that are not based nor locally nor regionally based in hierarchy. So this is challenging for me.
That sounds very interesting. That's great. And we're popping into all of your all's sessions and saw your all's shared documents, and they all look really great. And we're really excited what you guys are going to produce with these. Does anybody have any comments or suggestions for people's chapters, or any final thoughts they want to share?
Also, just to mention really quick, those in that folder, everybody can see them and whatnot. If you're not in a group in one, just don't edit anything, but those are going to stay accessible to all you guys so you can collaborate on them and such. And feel free to download them or, bring it over to a new platform to work on it. You don't have to just work on it there, but that folder will be available to all of you throughout the whole process. Okay, well, Grace, if nobody has any questions, then do you want to start our concluding remarks and statements and such?
Yeah, so the mini chapters, just to reiterate, without references, 1,500 to 2,000, 2,500 words. Those will be due at the same time as your individual chapters, which will be due the last day of June 30th. Will be when chapters and those mini chapters are going to be due as well. And then we are going to have organized the volume and hope to submit that to the publisher early fall. So that's the deadline for that. For individual chapters, just to reiterate, they will be, final chapters should be around 8,000 words. That is not including references. And please use the essay format when you are writing and formatting your paper. We've shared that link with you guys. You can also find it online. There's up to 8 figures for each chapter. So you can include up to 8 if you would like. Carly, what am I forgetting?
Well, those were just the 3 things. We just wanted to let you know. We'll send an email recapping all of this stuff and just kind of a general follow-up email to the workshop. I'm sure Grace and I can organize a couple more thoughts that we probably have that we can reiterate then. We can also include like those groups so you just kind of remember who's in them and everything. Yeah. Agreed, Daryl. No. So yeah, and then let me just, I actually also wrote down some stuff. Make sure you said everything. Oh, and so this whole conference, when we're together in this room, has been recording, as it tells you every single time that you bop in. So we're gonna just, edit some of our beginning and tail end stuff that is, not so relevant. So the size of the file is a little smaller, but hopefully we'll be able to get that up in the coming weeks, so you guys can rewatch presentations or things like that, because it's virtual for a long day, so I'm sure some zoning out definitely happened occasionally. So you'll have hopefully that in the next couple of weeks or so. And then just again to reiterate, we understand that there's like a lot of information coming at you from all sides a lot, and we really appreciate all of the time and effort and responses to emails and sending emails that you've done so far. But as always, if you ever have any questions about any aspect of this, please feel free to reach out at any time to anybody who's going to be, so Grace and I, for general questions, or if it's specific to Winslow, I'm sure Nathan and Colin are happy to field questions about that as well. So we just wanted to, yeah, we're finishing a little early today, but we just wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions about literally anything that's gone on so far in the workshop. If you would like to do that now in person rather than through a email, there's some time for that now. But we're very efficient today in terms of discussion, so we don't feel like we really need to keep you guys to just nod our heads. And obviously we're all kind of burnt. I'm sure a lot of you guys had an entire week of virtual learning, and now you have 2 days, and you're gonna have to go in another week of it probably right away. I'm sure you love us for that. So we really appreciate your guys's commitment to this whole process, because we understand that this is, Zoom fatigue, as they say in the industry. So, but yeah, so floor is open for any questions. Grace and I can hang out for a second too. So if people who are ready to leave can leave, but Grace and I can hang for a sec just to answer any questions if you have them. So.
I just want to thank you. Was a pleasure. Actually, what is an honor for me writing this book with you. So I had great times at this weekend, and thank you. And Monica, an honor. I'm writing with you the chapter, and well, I hope we can meet soon physically and with a lot of beers, and my English will become better. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and thank you, Francisco, for participating.
I just want to join to Francisco and thank the organizers, the hosts, and everyone that shared their work. It's been very stimulating. It's been very exciting. And just thinking about those chapters and those mini chapters, how they will look together, it's exciting. So I'm very happy to have met virtually all of you, and thank you very much for making this possible. And this is very exciting. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
I'll say it again on behalf of the Winslow board. It's been an honor to watch you guys work this weekend. This is the virtual format's not the one we envisioned when we started this, but you guys have made the most of it. The kind of collaborative environments, the cross-pollination of ideas, the generation of new knowledge, right? That's kind of all the goals of doing this kind of multi-day workshop here. And I think that there's already the makings of a great volume and a great contribution to the series. And we really appreciate all the participants, really hard work, but especially Grace and Carly for all your hard work and organizing everything, for putting everything together, and having to deal with all the logistical things as well. So we really appreciate all of that.
Yeah, and I actually thank you so much for that, Coleman. That we've loved working with you guys as well, and really appreciate this opportunity. I do want to get a picture, like Tina said. So I'm going to take a picture of everybody, so you can smile if you want to or not. Just so you know. Okay.
We did put the picture from the last one into the book, I think. So.
Oh, you did? All right, I'm doing it. 1, 2, 3.
This is what happens at every conference, is you should have a group photograph. I mean, otherwise it didn't really happen.
Thank you. Thank you.
We can also Photoshop Chad in. It'll be perfect.
This is why when you do a conference in China, you always have the opening comments, one troops out, and you have the photograph then. And then it's real, and everyone can go their own way. So.
All right, well, you've done it official. So
yeah,
we've got the photo.
Well, thank you, everybody. It has been an immense pleasure to see old and new friends and to meet all of you and to learn a great deal. And so here in St. Louis, it's a beautiful day, and I am about as brain dead as I'm going to get. So I'm going to just say thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon in some format that isn't in a postage stamp.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. This has been really great.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
It's been really great.
Good job.
Thank you, Grace and Carly.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.